I know that last question was something along the lines of, what do you want to get out of this call?
Right.
That last question would make me pause. I was going great until I got to that very last one. Every single time I had to submit that prep sheet to you, what do I want to get out of this call? Oh my gosh.
Right.
You know, you can kind of weenie out and say, I
Right.
want to brainstorm. But sometimes you had to brainstorm, but sometimes you were kind of weaning out like, I didn't really want to, I got to be pushed to really facing whatever the challenge is. And you would sniff it out though.
Yeah, totally. But one of the things I've added to my work with what I want to call VIP clients that we didn't do, Frank, is if someone has a question that needs answering like that day, and they just want somebody to talk about with it, they don't want to wait a week or 2 weeks. I do a 15-minute, I want to say pivot appointment, or I don't like to use the language crisis because then you attract crisis, but they're just 15-minute check-ins or 15-minute adjustment appointments. And people have really liked that. They don't need it all the time, but it's just something came up at work or something came up with their spouse or their kids, and they just want 15 minutes to say, this is what happened. This is how I'm looking at it. What's another way of looking at it? So it's that same question, but we get to expand on it more frequently.
Sure.
So.
Just for the audience so they understand, this weekly accountability, just think of it as the most detailed version of that momentum manifesto, right? Because you're backing out, you go from the weekly accountability and looking at your goals to that, or I should say the chunk down goals, and then you're backing out. So it's just a subset. What I would do is on my iPhone, I had in notes, I had basically 3 categories. The 3 categories were for the year, places I wanted to go or things I wanted to see was one. The second one was things I wanted to learn. And the third was things I wanted to achieve. That was sort of my dream list. I called it dream list. I never want to call it a bucket list, but that's really what it was. I call it the dream list. And it was those goals that you and I would say were aligned for the year. And I would put, of course, deadlines on when I wanted to, either see these things or learn something or achieve something. And by reviewing it, the key, like you said earlier, I can't overstate this enough, looking at these things like 3 times a week. It would be almost every day that I would look at notes and review it. Maybe I would make a little tweak to it. I didn't want to change the dates on. I wanted to kind of stay to it. But it really allowed me to keep it front and center. Because if you do this momentum manifesto and you put it in a file cabinet or you save it on your hard drive and you don't look at it again, it is useless. Like you're going to get none of it done. So I took like a subset of that and kept that on my iPhone and notes and just looked at it. But I think the weekly accountability, that's how the goals were all achieved in working with you. So
What you're saying, Frank, is brilliant. I love the way you organized it for your brain, your psychology. I mean, it was brilliant. And then, you came to coaching calls knowing what you wanted to work on, or we figured it out.
Yeah.
And then the next question was, so what do you want to do for the next week? What are the actions you want to take for your goals? And I also added a question. I don't know that you had that question. It was like, what is the progress you've made towards your goals, towards your 90-day goals since we last talked? So I added that at the bottom of the thing. But it is important at the end of the session to know what it is you're committing to, because that's got to go on the top of the next report, right? The next report.
So Sarah, I want to segue for a moment. I know I've told you this before, but I'm going to tell you again publicly. You were one of the most influential people during my career running I-9 Sports. You helped me through some really, really dark days, and I needed a coach. You were there for me. You were not easy on me. You never let me off the hook. It was one day I came to you on our call. Maybe it was back in like 2014. And other than my wife, I told nobody, other than Nadine, to say to you, I think it might be time for me to move on from the company. And the process that you helped me through, okay, first of all, it took a long time. Because I was very unsure, and it was a huge decision because I thought my company was my purpose in life. And as I look back on some of my notes, I look back on my coaching session notes recently, and I was like, oh my gosh, I can't believe we talked about that for as long as we did. But it was a huge, huge decision. Do you recall what it was like some of the things that maybe went on? I want to get it from your perspective as the coach, what you recall in me going through that.
It was a very big decision. I-9 had been one of your children,
Mm-hmm.
and you'd been in it for a very long time. I think I remember there were emotional pieces of feeling guilty. How
Mm-hmm.
could I go somewhere else? And what will this mean to Nadine? What will this mean to my team at I-9? You had invested so much time in building your team and a fabulous team. So I remember that it was a long time because, well, how many years were you in I-9?
Well, technically, I started developing the franchise in 2001. So our conversation really was like in 2014, we started talking about it. But my gosh, based on the amount of time I put in, it was probably 30 years I squeezed into 15.
Right. Well, so sometimes I like to compare that time. It took you 13 or 20 years to get to where you were.
hmm
It doesn't unravel overnight. You don't just, it's like pulling a tooth. You wouldn't, extract it out of your life. It's a process. It's a transition. And it's not just impacting you, it's
hmm
impacting everyone around you. It was intentional. It was very intentional. And the letter, remember, I know we talked
Okay. I
the
want to
letter.
I want to preface this by I just want to share with the audience how this whole thing came to be. You and I had worked together, week after week, and the big question was, should I stay or should I go? Should I consider selling it? And my heart was completely torn. I'll tell you, it's the one thing in my business that when I went home, obviously talked to my wife about it, is the only decision that my wife said to me, I can't help you with this. This is the one decision you're going to need to make on your own because you're going to have to live with it. And I felt like it was always a challenge. And I would say that every time you gave me the weekly accountability of you would give me homework, I always did it, except for one day you said to me, I want you to write, and this sounded very, very innocent. You said, Frank, I want you to write a love letter to your business. And I was like, okay. And the next coaching session we had, I didn't do it. And you asked me, did I do it? I said, why not? And I said, I couldn't bring myself to doing it. And then you said, will you do it next time we talk? And I said, yes. And then the next time we talked, I didn't do it. And I think you were picking up on that I wasn't ready to write it. Right. Sara, I didn't know what the love letter was going to look like. I couldn't even get myself to writing it. I want to share the contents with the audience, but I would love for you first to start out with the love letter. Like, what made you think for me to do this? How did that whole thing come to be? What were you hoping that I was going to get out of this homework assignment?
Well, so whatever we do in life, we have a vision of where it's going to go, whether it's a relationship with a loved one, or it's a business or a job or whatever it might be, and whether it's even short term or long term, but there's always a vision of what will be the end result. And so what happens is, when we make that change, it's like losing a good friend or a parent or someone to death, because they're no longer in your life. And so that consistent connection and emotion that you have with someone or something is now gone. And it's really grieving. So it's really hard to let go of something. I like to say divorce is a terrible thing, and it takes so much courage to leave someone. Things have to be really bad for someone to leave, because it breaks the vision that they had. All of a sudden, it's gone. And so it wasn't as negative for you with I-9, with
Mm-hmm.
your business. However, it was emotionally, you were ready. You wouldn't have even brought it up if that wasn't a consideration. Or, I think in our lives, we actually come to different pivot points in our lives where we get these signals that it's time to make a change. And so you were getting signals that it was time to make a change. So the letter is a way of having a conversation. It's almost like with another entity.
Yes.
You said you're going to read it, but you're having a conversation with this other entity, and you're saying, these were all the wonderful things that I experienced with you. And now it's time to change. Now it's time to move on.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a way of trying to sever that emotional connection so that you can start healing. In our hearts, we have places, good chambers, if you want
Right.
to call it, where your parents are, where your kids are, where your friends, your colleagues, whoever it might be. And now you're closing that, like you're kind of closing the door and locking it.
Sure.
And so that's what happens with this letter. It helps emotionally to separate without feeling guilty. It's the part of the process.
Thank you for tuning into the Emerging Franchise Brands podcast. For additional insights, guest applications, and to stay connected, visit us at efbpodcast.com. The Emerging Franchise Brands podcast is for entertainment purposes only, and the views expressed do not necessarily represent those of Emerging Franchise Brands, its host Frank Fiume, or Emerging Franchise Group, LLC. Any discussed franchise or investment opportunity requires thorough investigation, obtaining proper disclosure documents, and expert consultation before making any investment decisions. The podcast and its host do not offer professional advice or endorsements, and they hold no responsibility for actions, representations, accuracy, or consequential damages related to the podcast content.